You almost did not take this job. Perhaps the application was submitted without expectation, the interview was rescheduled, or another opportunity closed just before this one appeared. Then your name began landing beside theirs on calendars, assignments, shift changes, and meetings that kept running longer than planned. At first, it looked practical. Then the pattern became personal. Welcome back, beautiful soul. We are not using tarot to prove fate, promise marriage, or remove anyone's freedom. We are using it as a psychological mirror for timing, recognition, emotional growth, and the choices created when two people are repeatedly placed in the same space. The first image opening this story is the Page of Pentacles. Psychologically, this card can describe the beginning of something valuable arriving in an ordinary form, a new role, a training period, a task that seems small, an opportunity accepted for practical reasons, while its deeper emotional significance remains hidden. The Page of Pentacles suggests this connection may have entered through a doorway neither of you recognized as important. You were focused on learning, so were they. Perhaps one of you asked a simple question and the other answered with patience. Maybe a document changed hands, fingers nearly touched, and the pause lasted half a second longer than necessary. Perhaps they remembered a detail you mentioned during your first week, then brought it up later as though listening had become automatic. Nothing dramatic happened. That was why it felt safe. The workplace gave both of you permission to become familiar without naming the familiarity. They could check your progress and call it support. You could notice their mood and call it teamwork. Each small exchange looked harmless because it belonged to the job. But the page is holding the pentacle as though studying what it could become. That is the hidden tension here. This meeting may not have begun with certainty. It began with potential. Something requiring attention, patience, and action before its meaning could be understood. And the next card will reveal why this workplace, among every possible place, kept so consistently arranging reasons for you to meet again. The next image is the Queen of Wands. Psychologically, this card can describe recognition through observation. Noticing how someone carries responsibility, how they enter a room, how they respond when pressure rises and other people begin losing patience. The workplace gave you time to witness character. That may be why this meeting needed to happen here. In a social setting, attraction can form around presentation, a carefully chosen outfit, a charming conversation. The version of someone they intended to show for an hour. Work reveals something different. It reveals consistency. Perhaps you watched them remain calm during a difficult assignment. Maybe they corrected a mistake without humiliating the person who made it. They could have taken credit and chose to share it. They may appear confident around everyone else, yet become unexpectedly gentle when they notice you are overwhelmed. The Queen of Wands carries warmth without needing to demand attention. That quality may belong to them, or it may be what this connection is awakening in you. Perhaps you became more expressive around this person, more willing to speak during meetings, more comfortable offering an idea instead of keeping it to yourself. Their presence may have made you aware of your own competence because they responded as though your contribution mattered. Again, nothing had to be declared. The assignment created the conversation. The schedule created the encounter. A shared responsibility gave one of you a reason to approach the other without risking the vulnerability of admitting that you simply wanted to. This is how emotional architecture can form inside an ordinary routine. A question becomes familiarity. Familiarity becomes trust. Trust begins revealing the person beneath the role. The repeated meetings may not have been arranging a guaranteed relationship. They may have been creating enough time for both of you to see what would have remained invisible during one brief encounter. Their reliability, your patience, the way one of you notices tension before the other says anything, the way support appears quietly without an audience. And eventually, the repetition changed something. One of you stopped waiting to see whether the other would be there. You began expecting it. Perhaps before opening the meeting room door, you already listened for their voice. Before checking the schedule, you wondered whether your names would appear beside each other again. The professional awareness remained, but underneath it, something had begun arriving early. The next part of this story asks when noticing their presence quietly became anticipating it. The next image is the Four of Wands. Psychologically, this card can describe the moment routine begins to feel like belonging, not commitment, not certainty. Belonging. Perhaps you learned the rhythm of their day without trying. The time they usually arrived, the expression they wore after a difficult meeting, the way their voice changed when they were tired, even while telling everyone they were fine. Maybe they began learning yours. They knew which task you disliked before you complained about it. They placed a chair beside them during a crowded meeting. They remembered how you took your coffee, then acted as though remembering meant nothing. These details were small enough to deny. That was what made them powerful. The Four of Wands is often associated with shared space, but psychologically, shared space becomes meaningful when the nervous system begins recognizing safety inside it. The office did not change. The hallway remained the same. The break room still held the same chairs and ordinary conversations, but their presence altered how the place felt. Perhaps work became easier when they were near. Not because they completed everything for you, but because their steadiness helped you settle. You could watch how they handled pressure without becoming cruel, how they admitted an error without making excuses, how they helped someone when there was no audience to reward them. Competence became personal. Integrity became attractive, and neither of you needed to call it attraction yet. There may have been small ways the connection began extending beyond necessity. A question that had already been answered. A conversation continuing after the meeting ended. One of you walking more slowly so the other could catch up. Professional reasons remained available, but they were becoming less convincing. Then perhaps one day they were absent. Their chair was empty. Their name was missing from the schedule. Someone else completed the task they usually handled, and nothing was technically wrong. Still, the day felt different. You may have noticed how often you looked toward the doorway. They may have returned asking questions that sounded practical, while quietly trying to learn whether you had noticed they were gone. This does not prove a destined relationship. It reveals attachment entering awareness, because sometimes constant presence hides what distance immediately exposes. And the next part of this story begins with the change neither of you expected, the shift, reassignment, or interruption that made ordinary familiarity suddenly feel difficult to lose. The next image is the setting sun. Psychologically, this card can describe what becomes visible when a familiar rhythm begins to end. A shift changes. A project closes. One of you is moved to another team, another floor, or another schedule. At first, the disruption may have looked temporary, something practical, a staffing decision, a responsibility that needed attention elsewhere. But the emotional effect was immediate. Perhaps you told yourself the day felt strange because the workflow had changed. Maybe they said they were only checking in because they needed an update. Both of you could still explain the discomfort without naming the person at the center of it. That explanation may have worked for a while. Then you saw each other again. The setting sun suggests a quieter kind of exposure. Feelings become easier to recognize when there is less activity available to hide them. The workday is ending, other people are leaving. The conversation should be finished. Yet, neither of you moves immediately. Perhaps their expression softened before they remembered to control it. Maybe they asked where you had been with more urgency than the question required. One of you offered a detailed explanation for the absence, even though the other had not asked for one. The words remained ordinary, the relief did not. Still, awareness does not always create action. Sometimes it creates restraint. There may be policies to respect. A difference in authority. A reputation neither person wants to risk. Existing responsibilities that cannot be ignored. Or simply the fear that naming the connection could damage the one place where it has been allowed to grow safely. Caution is not always avoidance. Sometimes it is care wearing a formal expression, but care can become painful when both people are protecting the same connection from opposite sides. One remains quiet because they do not want to pressure the other. The other interprets that silence as indifference and becomes quieter too. So the conversations continue. A deadline, a schedule, a question about tomorrow, nothing that would reveal how much attention now sits beneath each sentence. Both of you may be standing near the same truth while privately believing you are alone there, and then something interrupts the restraint. A mistake is discovered. A meeting turns difficult. Pressure enters the room before either of you has time to prepare. In that moment, professional distance may disappear, because the next part of this story will reveal whom one of you instinctively turns toward when there is no time left to hide what feels safe. The next image is the Fool reversed. Psychologically, this card can describe the moment careful behavior gives way to instinct, not recklessness. Exposure. Perhaps the disruption came during a meeting when someone questioned your judgment too sharply. Maybe a mistake was blamed on the wrong person. An urgent deadline arrived without warning, or a private phone call left one of you trying to remain composed while the room continued moving around them. There was no time to prepare a neutral response, and the other person reacted. Maybe they corrected the accusation before considering how protective they sounded. Perhaps they quietly took part of the workload, moved closer, or asked whether you were all right in a voice that carried more concern than the situation appeared to require. The Fool reversed can reflect the fear of revealing too much, but instinct often speaks before fear has time to intervene. Under pressure, people tend to move toward what feels important. They look for the person they trust. They defend what they value. They notice distress that everyone else overlooks. Perhaps you looked across the room and found them already watching you. Perhaps they heard the change in your voice before anyone else did. The moment may have lasted only minutes. Its meaning lasted longer. Afterward, one of you may have become unusually formal. A simple thank you was answered too quickly. Eye contact became harder. The next conversation stayed carefully focused on work, as though returning to procedure could erase what had just been revealed. It could not. Distance after closeness does not always mean regret. Sometimes it means the closeness felt real enough to frighten someone. The crisis did not create this bond. It removed the professional disguise that had been covering it. For one unguarded moment, concern was no longer hidden inside assistance. Loyalty was no longer explained as teamwork. It became personal. Still, neither of you may know what to do with that knowledge. One person may fear repeating an old mistake, trusting too quickly, giving too much, or becoming attached to someone unavailable. The other may associate intimacy with responsibility, loss, or the possibility of disappointing someone they genuinely respect. So comfort activates fear, and fear creates distance from the very person who made the difficult moment feel safer. The next part of this story asks what older emotional pattern this workplace has brought to the surface, and why meeting each other has made that pattern impossible to ignore. The next image is the star, reversed. Psychologically, this card can describe the moment hope becomes difficult to receive, not because it is absent, because receiving it feels unfamiliar. Perhaps one of you has learned to be useful before learning to be cared for. You take the extra task, cover the shift, solve the problem before anyone notices you are tired. At work, this can look like competence, but beneath it, there may be an older belief. If I am needed, I am safe. If I stop giving, I may stop mattering. The star reversed can reflect the exhaustion created when self-worth depends on constant effort. And this connection may be exposing that pattern because the other person notices what you usually hide. Perhaps they tell you to go home instead of praising you for staying late. Maybe they complete something without making you feel indebted. They respect a boundary instead of testing how much you will tolerate. That kind of care can feel comforting. It can also feel suspicious. A soul contract in this sense is not a promise written somewhere beyond your control. It is a dynamic that brings an unfinished lesson close enough to be recognized. For you, the lesson may be receiving without immediately repaying. For them, it may be giving without controlling the outcome. One of you may need to stop accepting partial attention because waiting feels easier than asking for clarity. The other may need to stop hiding behind responsibility when honesty would require vulnerability. The workplace makes these patterns visible. Who takes credit? Who apologizes too quickly? Who offers help? Who quietly expects too much in return? And if one person holds authority over the other, then care must include restraint, ethical distance, clear consent, protection from pressure. A meaningful connection does not become more sacred by ignoring boundaries. Sometimes it becomes more meaningful by respecting them. This may be why the bond feels larger than attraction. It is asking both of you to become different inside it, not more impressive, more honest. Perhaps the first promise here is not romance. It is restored self-respect. And the timing matters because this job may have appeared while both of you were already losing something. An old relationship, an old identity, or a future you once believed would unfold differently. The next image is the Seven of Swords. Psychologically, this card can describe the parts of a transition that remain hidden while life appears to continue normally. Perhaps you entered this job after leaving something emotionally exhausting. A relationship that required too much explanation. A career path that no longer felt like yours. A version of yourself built around surviving rather than choosing. Maybe they arrived carrying something similar. Not the same story, the same unfinished feeling. One of you may have accepted this role after nearly applying somewhere else. The other may have been transferred unexpectedly, filling a position they never intended to keep. Perhaps the interview date changed twice. Maybe your paths had almost crossed before, through another company, a shared acquaintance, or a place one of you left just before the other arrived. These details can feel uncanny, but they do not remove choice. The Seven of Swords asks what each person was trying to leave behind and what they may still be carrying quietly into this connection. Perhaps you had decided never to become emotionally involved with someone at work. Maybe they had learned to conceal tenderness beneath competence. One of you was recovering from burnout. The other was grieving an identity that no longer fit while appearing perfectly functional to everyone around them. Neither of you arrived empty. You arrived with unfinished decisions. Then this connection began awakening what had gone quiet. Confidence returned. Softness became less dangerous. A future that once seemed closed became imaginable again. Perhaps the universe did not arrange this job only so you could find each other. Perhaps it arranged a crossroads where each of you would meet the version of yourself capable of choosing differently. That is a more demanding possibility, because awakening does not eliminate fear. It makes avoidance more uncomfortable. You may begin noticing where you hide behind professionalism. They may begin recognizing how often they disappear emotionally before anyone can ask what they truly want. The connection becomes meaningful, not because it excuses these patterns, but because it exposes them. And exposure can create distortion. A glance may carry more meaning than it was given. A delayed message may feel like rejection. Ordinary conversations with other people may awaken jealousy neither of you feels entitled to admit. This is where intensity can become confused with certainty. The next part of this story will examine the shadow forming beside the connection and whether what feels like intuition is creating clarity or quietly becoming projection. The next image is the Page of Swords, reversed. Psychologically, this card can describe what happens when attention becomes restless. Not because the feeling is false, because uncertainty begins asking for constant proof. Perhaps you notice every change in their tone, every shift in the schedule, every conversation they have with someone else. A delayed reply feels heavier than it should. A brief glance becomes something you replay later, searching for confirmation. This is where recognition can become interpretation, and interpretation can become exhaustion. The Page of Swords reversed may reflect a mind trying to solve an emotional question that has not yet been answered through action. You may know their habits, their moods, the expression they wear when they are hiding stress, but knowing someone at work is not always the same as knowing what they intend. That distinction matters. Intuition usually creates a quieter awareness. It helps you notice what is consistent. It allows uncertainty to exist without demanding that every detail become evidence. Anxiety behaves differently. It checks. It compares. It turns ordinary moments into tests the other person does not know they are taking. Perhaps you feel threatened when they laugh with someone else. Maybe they become distant after seeing you speak warmly to a colleague. Neither of you says anything because jealousy would reveal an attachment that has never been defined. So the mind fills the silence. Still, doubt can distort in the opposite direction. One of you may dismiss genuine care because accepting it feels too vulnerable. Consistent support is called politeness. Thoughtful attention is explained away. The connection is minimized before it has the chance to disappoint you. Neither fantasy nor denial creates clarity. Behavior does. Do they respect your boundaries? Do their actions remain consistent when nobody is watching? Is effort reciprocal? Does this connection protect your dignity or keep you suspended inside confusion? The shadow of this soul contract may be asking both of you to stop repeating something familiar, chasing someone unavailable, hiding behind silence, accepting ambiguity indefinitely, calling fear protection because honesty would require a choice. Indirect signs can only carry a connection so far. Eventually, attraction must become honesty, or boundary, or release. And the next part of this story begins when one of you decides that another glance across the room is no longer enough. The next image is the solar eclipse. Psychologically, this card can describe a moment when what has been hidden can no longer remain entirely hidden. Not revelation without consequence. Revelation requiring choice. Perhaps one of you has rehearsed the conversation more than once. A sentence formed during the drive to work. A question repeated silently before a meeting. An intention to stay behind for 1 minute longer than usual. Then the moment arrives. The room empties. The task is finished, and neither of you immediately leaves. The solar eclipse can reflect a threshold where familiar roles briefly lose their authority. Coworker, supervisor, teammate, the person who always has a practical reason to remain composed. For a moment, those roles do not disappear, but they stop being enough. Perhaps one of you admits that the connection has begun to feel significant. Maybe the honesty is smaller than a confession. You say that the distance felt strange. They acknowledge that they notice when you are absent. One person asks whether the other has also felt the change. The words may be careful. They should be, because courage does not require abandoning judgment. If there is unequal authority, an existing commitment, or a policy that makes pursuit inappropriate, then the honest choice may be to wait, to create distance, to protect both people until consent can exist without pressure. That is not failure. It is integrity. In another situation, the choice may be to speak clearly instead of continuing through hints. To ask rather than assume. To accept an answer without turning spiritual meaning into obligation. Courage can look like approaching. It can look like pausing. Sometimes it looks like releasing the version of the connection that requires secrecy, confusion, or self-betrayal. The job may have arranged the meeting. It cannot make the decision. That belongs to both of you. And perhaps this is the strongest evidence that the connection carries meaning. Not that it feels intense, but that it asks each person to become more honest more responsible, and less willing to hide behind ambiguity. An eclipse does not create what it reveals. It changes the conditions under which it can be seen. The next part of this story will answer the deepest question beneath the title. The real reason your paths were placed together, even if the truth is different from the future either of you first imagined. The final image is the Three of Wands, reversed. Psychologically, this card can describe a future that does not unfold in the exact form first imagined. That does not make the meeting meaningless. It may reveal its meaning more clearly. The real reason this job brought you together may not have been to guarantee a relationship, a wedding, or a permanent place in each other's lives. It may have been to interrupt an old emotional direction, to teach one of you that affection can feel safe, to teach the other that care must become consistent before it can be trusted. Perhaps you were brought together so you could stop confusing longing with love. So they could stop confusing silence with protection. So both of you could recognize that a meaningful connection should not require either person to disappear inside it. The Three of Wands reversed can reflect the release of a future built entirely through expectation. You may have imagined where this could lead. They may have done the same. But the deeper contract was never ownership of the outcome. It was growth through the encounter. The calendars mattered because they created repetition. The assignments mattered because they revealed character. The meetings that lasted too long mattered because they gave both of you time to become familiar without forcing intimacy before trust existed. Then distance revealed attachment, pressure revealed loyalty, and honesty revealed choice. That is how the Page of Pentacles returns to this story. What began as a small opportunity became something worthy of attention. Not because it promised a particular ending, but because it asked both of you to handle the potential with maturity. Perhaps this becomes a lasting partnership. Perhaps circumstances change and the connection can be pursued carefully and openly. Perhaps it becomes a friendship that alters how both of you understand care. Or perhaps it prepares you to recognize healthier love when it arrives. The castle in this story is not proof of marriage. It is the structure you learn to build. Stability, reciprocity, respect. A place where affection does not require confusion to feel powerful. And the job was never merely the location where you met. It was the classroom where both of you learned what a different kind of connection could feel like. So, beautiful soul, consider what this person awakened in you and what you are now unwilling to abandon in yourself, regardless of where the connection goes.